Hello, this is John Armwood. I'm back again for Volume 3 of our discussion on the intersection of politics, culture, and technology in America as we view it through the prism of race relations. In the last episode on this YouTube channel, we discussed it through the period of time that covered World War II's outbreak to the Brown versus School Board decision in 1954. So we went from basically 1941 to 1954, and we saw how that the fight against Japan and later the fight against communism helped to change America's society, in that the fight against racism could be used by America's enemies as a tool against America. In fact, it was clearly attempted. We discussed that in the last episode in World War II, and we discussed how that impacted the Brown versus the School Board decision in 1954. This episode, we're going to be discussing the civil rights movement from the 1950s through the 1960s. We can think of, in particular, the Little Rock, Arkansas school integration cases, which came in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education a couple of years later, the sit-ins that occurred during the late 50s and early 60s, the integration of old myths, and the fact that U.S. troops had to be sent into Little Rock, Arkansas. They had a National Guard had to be nationalized both there in Arkansas and also in Mississippi for Ole Miss. We know the sit-ins that happened throughout the South and the freedom rides. We know the killings of the civil rights workers in Mississippi in that horrible summer in, I believe it was 1964. They made a film about it, Mississippi Burning. So we know about these things, but a lot of people don't realize what was happening there was what we call interest conversion. First discussed by the former Harvard and NYU law professor Derek Bell, and where he talked about where the interests of people of color coincide with the interests of certain elements of the white society. When those interests converge, come together, we make progress. And when those interests go apart, we're sacrificed for what he called involuntary sacrifice. The whole critical race studies movement in academia started with Mr. Bell, Professor Bell, Attorney Bell, a former actually civil rights lawyer under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall when he was in the NAACP, the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. So the connections here are very, very close and intertwined. But Bell came to the conclusion, as most black scholars, I think today, have come to the conclusion that the gains we made during the civil rights movement, though real and relieved specific conditions that we were suffering from, really did nothing to alleviate the economic inequality and social inequality that occurred in this country. Now, we're not saying that the gains on the integration of public accommodations that came as a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Housing Act, which opened up the doors for people of color and also for Jewish people to live where they were being discriminated against and kept from living before. Yes, it did those things. And the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 opened the door to immigration for peoples of particularly Asian and African descent. We saw the huge wave of Koreans, in fact, coming to the country starting in the 70s. That was a direct result of changes caused by the civil rights movement. So we did have some tangible results, but when we look at economic inequality, we see that it really hasn't changed since 1958, because that's not what it was about. When Martin Luther King was killed, he was working on a poor people's march to change economic inequality. And it hasn't changed in 50 years. It hasn't changed. What happened was that the fight against communism converged with the interests of civil rights marchers and the interests of people of color in destroying the barriers to integration that were in law. And so 64 Civil Rights Act, the Housing Act of 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, and the amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in 1973, which dealt with gender discrimination against women. Those were all done in large part because there was a convergence of interests between those peoples who were suffering from the oppression of the conditions in the United States and the fight against communism as the countries in Africa and Asia who had been under the domination rather, of the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Belgians fought and won their political independence. And I say political independence because the economic situations even there are still tied to the countries of Western Europe and to white power structures. So that's basically the point of this video, is to make it clear that the gains that were made in large part because of a convergence in interest between everyday people living in the United States, people of color, and the convergence of the white industrialists in the North and globalists who in fact owned the media. So they covered the demonstrations. They covered Bull Connor and his dogs and his fire hoses attacking people of color. That was on television. The Telstar technology, as well as, of course, television technology, allowed it to be easily broadcast around the world. So the United States was claiming to be a beacon of freedom and independence and talking about how horrible the Soviet Union was, but you had horrible things happening here in the United States. And so the convergence of those interests led to some largely cosmetic changes in the conditions of people of color. But we still have tremendous poverty at rates that are basically the same as in 1968. They're within the 4-point margin of error difference that statisticians use to measure these type of changes and differences. And we see now that the war on drugs, which started in the 70s and accelerated in the 1880s and 90s and the early parts of this century, have imprisoned an enormous number of people of color, particularly African Americans. So we see that we went through slavery's end in 1942 that we discussed last week, to the end of legal segregation in the 1960s, 1964, and then we entered the era of mass incarceration. So as technology changes, the form of domination changes, but the domination does not end. So we're going to get to, very soon, the strategies that we need to look for today to improve our conditions. What areas are there available today that we can make progress in where there is interest convergence between peoples of color and white America? We're going to talk about those in the next volume of videos. And I can tell you a little bit about it. We're going to look at the midterm elections and how the interests of people of color and interests of certain white interests, in particular suburban white women, converge. And also globalists, how these interests converge again. And so we'll be discussing that in the next video. Please, please hit the like button. It really affects the channel. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell that you'll see right beneath the video when you go out of full screen mode. Hit that bell. That helps us, and we can continue doing these videos, and you'll get a notice when there's a new video coming. So thank you for taking the time and listen. Please make comments below. Let me know what you think. Let me know which I can improve. Let me know about what you'd like me to discuss, research, or add to this discussion. And I'll see you in the next video.